The sun was going down behind the low hills, painting the small western town in soft orange light. Dust moved through the street with the evening wind. The air was quiet, only the sound of boots and wagon wheels breaking the silence. People had gathered in the square because word had spread. She was coming again. Her name was Clara May. Everyone in town knew that name. She was the widow of a miner who had died years ago, leaving her alone with debts and a piece of dry land no one wanted. After her husband's death, something inside her seemed to harden. She was strong, too strong for most folks. Tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. Her eyes were sharp, her voice deep, and when she walked, it sounded like thunder on the wooden boards. No one wanted to cross her. The last man who called her names ended up lying in the dirt with a broken jaw. Since then, people only whispered behind her back. Some said she was cursed, others said she had the strength of 10 men. But the truth was simpler. Clara May was just tired. Tired of being alone, tired of losing everything, tired of being treated like something to fear. On that day, she came to the town square with a folded paper in her hand. It was her husband's land deed. She had tried for months to pay off the debt, but the bank had taken everything. Now she had nothing left but pride, and even that felt too heavy to carry. She stood tall in the middle of the square, the evening wind catching her hair. Her plain dress clung to her from the day's heat, and her hands were rough from fieldwork. She faced the banker and said, "500. That's what it's worth. I won't take less." The banker looked nervous. His thin face turned red as he shifted from one foot to the other. "Mrs. May, no one's likely to pay that much for your land. The soil's gone dry." Her eyes cut through him like a blade. 500, she said again. Her voice was calm but final. People around her whispered. Some laughed under their breath. A few women stood behind the general store shaking their heads. The sheriff leaned against a post, pretending to look busy. No one wanted to speak to her. She was too much for them. Too tall, too different, too proud. And then, from the far end of the street, a horse came walking slow through the dust. The man riding it was quiet, his hat low, his shirt faded from the sun. His name was Luke Callahan, a cowboy from the southern range. He wasn't known to many, but those who had heard of him said he was steady, fair, and kept to himself. He had been driving cattle for years, saving what little he could. He stopped near the well and watched the crowd. When he saw Clara standing there, something in his eyes changed. He didn't see a monster or a problem. He saw a woman trying to stand tall while the world pushed her down. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked toward her. The crowd turned silent. No one had ever walked up to Clara May before without fear. 500, she said again, not looking at him. That's the price, Luke nodded once. I'll pay it. Everyone froze. The banker blinked. The sheriff pushed himself off the post. What did you say, son? I said I'll pay it, Luke repeated. His voice was calm, firm. 500. Clara turned her head slowly, studying him. No man had ever spoken to her like that. You don't even know what you're buying, she said. I'm not buying the land, Luke answered. I'm buying your freedom. The words hit her harder than any insult ever had. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. Someone whispered that the cowboy must be crazy. Another man laughed nervously. The banker frowned. Sir, you can't just... Luke reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He poured the coins and bills onto the banker's desk. Count it, he said. 500, the banker stammered. It's all here. Then Luke looked at Clara again. You shouldn't have to beg these people for fairness, he said quietly. You've worked harder than any of them. If they can't see that, that's their loss. She stared at him, her eyes wide but unreadable. Why would you do this? She asked. Because I can, he said, and because no one else will. The sheriff stepped forward. Cowboy, are you sure about this? She's not. I know who she is, Luke said, and I mean what I said. Then he turned to the banker and added, Make it official. I want to marry her. His voice was steady, quiet, but it carried across the whole square like thunder rolling down the valley. A gasp went through the crowd. A woman dropped her basket. A boy shouted, He's crazy. Clara's heart pounded. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to speak but couldn't. All her life, men had looked at her with fear, pity, or disgust. And now this stranger, this calm cowboy, was looking at her with something she had not seen in years. Respect. You don't even know me, she whispered. Maybe not, he said. But I know enough. The banker wiped his brow. Well, if that's your wish, I can sign the papers right here. The sheriff looked from one to the other. You both sure? Luke nodded. I am. Clara hesitated. The crowd was still watching, whispering. She wanted to turn away, to walk off into the hills like she always did when people stared. But she couldn't move. Something deep inside her, something buried under years of loneliness, began to stir. Slowly, she reached out her hand. It was large, rough, and strong. Luke took it in both of his. His touch was gentle, warm. The moment their hands met, the noise around them faded. For a few seconds, it felt like there was no one else in the world. Then it's done, the sheriff said quietly. The banker wrote fast, his hand shaking. When the last paper was signed, Luke handed her the deed. Yours again, he said. She took it slowly, her eyes never leaving his. You don't know what you've done, she said softly. Maybe I do, he replied. Maybe it's time someone did. By sunset, the story had spread to every corner of town. The giant widow was married, to a cowboy who had walked in out of nowhere and given up his savings for her. Some said he was a fool. Others said he must have been desperate. But the ones who had seen the look in his eyes knew better. That evening, they stood together under the chapel's small roof, while the old preacher read the vows. Clara wore a plain gray dress. There were no flowers, no crowd, no music, just the sound of wind through the trees and the quiet voice of the man beside her saying, I do. When the preacher finished, Luke looked at her and said softly, You're free now. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. Then her hand found his again. The strength that had scared everyone else now felt like safety to him. As the night settled, they rode out of town together. The sky was wide and full of stars. Behind them, the lights of the town grew smaller until they were gone. In front of them stretched open land, endless and quiet. No one followed. No one spoke their names again that night. But from that day on, people remembered the cowboy who paid $500 not to own something, but to give someone back her life. And somewhere on the trail, the tall widow who had scared everyone smiled for the first time in years. The morning air was cold when they reached the edge of the valley. The hills rolled out before them, covered with dry grass that moved like waves under the wind. The sun was still low, painting everything in gold. Clara rode her horse quietly beside Luke, her long braid resting over her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the far horizon. She had not spoken much since they left the town. Luke kept glancing at her. He didn't expect her to talk, not after what had happened. He just wanted her to feel safe. His hat was pulled low, his coat dusty, his hands rough from years of riding. He had seen many things on the trail, storms, fires, and lonely nights, but never had he met someone who carried silence the way she did. After a few miles, she finally spoke. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Done what? He asked. Married me, she replied. They'll talk about you now. They'll call you a fool. Luke smiled a little. They already have. Doesn't bother me much. She looked at him then, studying his calm face. You gave away $500, she said. Why would a man do that for a woman he doesn't know? He took a deep breath. Because I saw something worth it, he said. You were standing there alone while the whole town turned against you. I've seen strong men break for less. I figured maybe you just needed someone to stand beside you. She said nothing. Her eyes turned back to the hills, but something inside her softened. By noon, they reached an old cabin on a small piece of land near the river. It wasn't much, just a roof, a corral, and a fence that needed fixing, but it was quiet and far from the town. Luke had bought it years ago as a resting place between drives. We'll stay here, he said, dismounting and helping her down. You can rest here as long as you like. She hesitated, her boots touching the ground. And you? She asked. I'll stay too, he said. It's our home now if you want it to be. For a moment, she didn't answer. She looked at the small cabin, then at him. No one had ever offered her a home before, not without asking something in return. Inside, the air smelled of wood and smoke. There was a single bed, a stove, and a table made from rough planks. It was simple, but it felt alive. She walked slowly around, her fingers brushing the walls. It's quiet, she said softly. That's the best part, he replied. The days that followed were quiet, but not lonely. Clara woke early to draw water from the river and cook. Luke worked outside fixing fences, mending saddles, and cutting wood. They spoke little, but each word they shared mattered. When he came back at sunset, she always had a warm meal ready. When she fell asleep by the fire, he would quietly cover her with his coat. Sometimes at night, Clara would wake and hear the wind moving through the hills. She would look across the room and see Luke asleep on the chair, his hat tilted over his face. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid of the dark. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara looked at him and said, "You don't know what people said about me. They called me a beast. They said I scared men away." Luke poked the fire with a stick. "Maybe they were just small men," he said. She looked at him sharply, expecting him to smile, but he was serious. "You're strong, Clara," he said. "There's nothing wrong with that. The world's just not used to women who stand tall." Her eyes filled with something between surprise and sorrow. "No one ever said that to me before." "Then they were wrong," he said simply. The next morning they worked together. He showed her how to mend the fences, and she helped him lift the heavy rails with ease. He watched her move with power and grace. She watched him with quiet respect. By noon they had repaired half the corral, laughing softly when the nails bent or the board slipped. For a while, they forgot about the town. The land became their world, the smell of earth, the river's sound, the way the sunlight touched the hills. Clara found herself humming again, something she hadn't done since her husband died. Weeks passed and they built a rhythm together. One day, a wagon from town came rolling down the trail. The banker and the sheriff were inside. Luke saw them first. He stood by the gate, his hands resting on his belt. "Heard you settled out here," the sheriff said. "Folks are talking." "They always do," Luke answered calmly. The banker looked nervous. "We just came to see if Mrs. Callahan," he hesitated on the new name, "was doing all right." Clara stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood tall, the wind tugging at her braid. "You can tell them I'm doing fine," she said firmly. "And you can tell them to stop using my name for gossip." The banker swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." As the wagon rolled away, Luke smiled a little. "You handled that well." She looked at him. "I'm done being afraid of them," she said. That night they sat outside by the fire again. The stars were bright, the sky clear. Clara leaned back against a log, her hair loose for the first time. Luke handed her a cup of coffee. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel peace again." "You earned it," he said. She turned to him. "You never asked for anything." "Not once." "There's nothing to ask for," he said softly. "Being here is enough." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire cracked. The wind rustled through the dry grass. She looked at him, this quiet man who had walked into her life without judgment or fear. Something in her chest ached, not from sadness but from warmth she didn't know how to name. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For seeing me," she whispered. "No one ever did." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the silence between them said more than words ever could. The seasons began to change. By winter, snow covered the hills. Luke built a new barn, and Clara filled it with wood and supplies. When storms came, they sat inside by the fire, telling stories about their pasts. He told her about the ranch he once dreamed of owning. She told him about her childhood by the river, before life had turned hard. One morning, after a heavy snow, Clara stepped outside and looked over the land. Smoke rose from the chimney and the world was white and still. Luke came out behind her, wrapping a blanket over her shoulders. "Looks like the world's gone quiet," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe it finally decided to rest." "Maybe we did too," he said. She turned toward him then. For the first time since they met, she smiled fully, soft, real, and bright like the winter sun. "You were right," she said. "I did need someone to stand beside me," he nodded. "And I needed someone who could stand strong." They stood there together, watching the light spread across the snow. The wind moved through the pines, gentle and slow. For a long time, neither spoke. They didn't have to. Everything that needed to be said was already written in the quiet between them. When spring came again, wildflowers grew along the fence line. Travelers passing by sometimes saw them working side by side and asked who they were. Most never recognized her as the widow from town. To them, she was just Clara Callahan, the tall woman who lived on the hill with the cowboy who once gave everything he had for her. And in the evenings, when the sun sank low and the wind carried the scent of grass and smoke, they would sit together by the fire, their hands close, their hearts at peace. She had once been the woman everyone feared. Now she was simply loved.